Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us here on Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. I really appreciate all of you joining us today on Living in Mexico. There's a lot of news that has to do with the United States and a lot of news that has to do with Canada and the impact decisions being made by President Donald Trump that could affect the negotiation process by of the USMCA. Joining us today once again is Dr. Juan Carlos Baker. You all know him well. He's been joining us throughout the years. He's the former negotiator of the USMCA. He is currently a professor at the Pan American University. He was the deputy at the Ministry of Commerce. Dr. Juan Carlos Baker, once again, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us here on Living in Mexico. Let's start with some of the statements made by President, by someone who wants to be president, by Secretary of Commerce Marcelo Ebrard, where he has expressed optimism regarding the future of the USMCA. He talked about. I was reading some of the headlines of some of the national newspapers this week, in which he assured that there would be results the upcoming weeks. Basically, thanks to the fact that Mexico has had, I don't know, more than 80 meetings with the USTR. Just kind of give us a sense. What's the status of the negotiation between Mexico and the United States right now?
Of course, Ana Maria, and good morning. Thank you for having me again. Sure, as always. I think that I will characterize the present status of the negotiations in two ways. On the one hand, there is a negotiation ongoing between Mexico and the United States on that famous 90-day truce that was agreed by President Sheinbaum and President Trump. That was back in July. It seems like light years away, no? But that is coming up to an end sometime next week. And on that end, what the Mexican government has been doing, in the words of Secretary Ebrard himself, is that the Mexican government has been addressing most of the items that President Trump expressed concerns on Mexico's policy. We don't really know what those items are because the list was never made public, but from time to time, we heard that Mexico was moving ahead. And it seems that the US is relatively happy about that. And I'm saying relatively happy because with Donald Trump, you never actually know. It is likely that he will just argue that more work is necessary and he will just kick the can down the road again on those tariffs that may or may not be imposed on Mexico based on the truce that was struck by the two presidents in July. So that one is ongoing, and we should be seeing an end in whatever form in a few days from today. Now, on the other front, I would probably call it the formal, quote unquote, front of the USMCA and the negotiations between Mexico and the United States. The USTR in the US and the Secretaría de Economía in Mexico published decrees asking for input by the general public, the stakeholders, companies, and the like, on how the USMCA should be addressed next year. Now, that process is still ongoing. In the case of the US, the comment period closes on November the 3rd, and in Mexico, it closes on November 13th. Now, that is the first step, Ana Maria, towards the review as it is mandated by the text of the USMCA itself. So this will be probably the most formal thing that you can obtain or that you can get to right now in anticipation of the USMCA process. Now, for what I've heard and people that I have talked to, both here and in the United States, and also in Canada, but to a lesser degree, the participation in those comment period has been overwhelming. I've seen several people filing comments, and I've seen several organized efforts by companies, individual companies, but also local business communities and sectoral chambers and the like to produce and submit comments to the Ministry of the Economy and USTR. And that gives me a good vibe. I would probably close with this because the more people, the more companies, the broader the participation by the stakeholder community, Ana Maria, I believe that there will be fewer chances that the most radical ideas and the most, ardent opponents of the USMCA will prevail in this battle of ideas as to what should be the future of the agreement. No.
Juan Carlos, what surprises me that those, like what you call stakeholders, but we're talking about companies, we're talking about organizations, individuals that have benefited, and industries that have benefited from the USMCA, this trilateral agreement between the three countries. What surprises me is that we haven't heard very much. I mean, I don't see like a wave of industries or spokespersons coming out to defend the USMCA. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right, and that's actually been one of the most, I would say, outstanding criticisms, both in the U.S. and in the Mexico too, but more in the U.S. That if all the people, all the companies that somewhat have benefited or have operations under the USMCA rules just come out publicly, well, this should be no debate at all, right? That the USMCA should be kept and enhanced and strengthened. But the problem is that I believe that there's this perception or this preoccupation rather that if well, you know how the saying goes, the nail that stands out is the one that gets hammered. I think that's how it goes in English.
Right.
So for those companies that are, let's say, too public in its views, either in favor of the USMCA or against tariffs and against the decisions of President Trump, well, probably that company is going to be, paid a visit by authorities or somehow will be singled out by the government, and nobody really wants that. So when I've asked those same questions that you just posed to me in certain business forum, some of the answers that I most commonly get are things like we are quietly working behind the scenes, or
Mm-hmm.
we are discreetly reaching out to key people. I mean, they never really elaborate on what that means,
Mm-hmm.
but that's to say that yes, I believe that you are correct. People are not necessarily making their voices equally heard as I mean those voices in support of the USMCA might not be speaking as loud as those that are opposing the USMCA or just favoring tariffs in general. I mean, you don't have to really oppose the USMCA to be a protectionist. No,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that people in Nebraska or people in other places they love that President Trump is placing tariffs on other countries, but at the same time they want to maintain the access open for their exports to Mexico or to other markets, which is try to have your cake and eat it at the same time too. No?
Joining us today is Juan Carlos Baker. I really appreciate you joining us at a time where, it was interesting, some of the statements made by Secretary of Commerce, Marcelo Ebrard, this week, Juan Carlos, that he is concerned that among the issues that could be brought up in the USMCA negotiation is items or issues like the justice reform in Mexico, issues that have nothing to do with commerce, but a lot to do with politics and the internal functioning of Mexico's democracy. As our audience know, the judges are now being elected in Mexico. Do you is this a real fear? And two, what should Mexico do about this? I mean, how are they going to react to these demands from potential demands, which are more political in nature, from the U.S. government?
No, I think that Secretary Brad's remarks highlight a very serious concern on Mexico, and I've heard this in several articulations, on several sort of avatars of the preoccupation itself, and it goes more or less like this. President Trump has left very clear that he will use every tool available to him in order to pursue his agenda. So if he believes that Mexico should be doing more on migration, to quote any issue, and the way and in his mind, the way to make Mexico move towards that goal of his is to punish, quote unquote, Mexico um, through the USMCA, or put pressure on Mexico through the USMCA, he will do it. I mean, the history tells us that that's exactly what he does. Now, how could Mexico probably, I wouldn't say fully contain, I don't think that's possible, but at least try to diminish or the opportunities, or to close down avenues that President Trump could use? Well, there are two things that come to mind. One of them would be that, Mexico does not engage in decisions or activities that could be controversial, or that could be arguably against the spirit of the USMCA, right? So, yes, we know that Mexico has all its right to amend the Constitution, but clearly certain amendments, recent amendments that were promoted in the view of the United States, are not necessarily USMCA compliant, right? So if you know that there will be issues that the US is going to react badly on, well, don't pursue them. At least not for the time that these talks are happening, right? Because you really are giving ammunition to the other side of the aisle, no? And the second thing that I believe that Mexico can do proactively in order to diminish those spaces that I just mentioned, is that Mexico should also have its own list of requests to the United States. I mean, this is a two-way street
Give me
in
some
any case.
examples. I mean, give me, so when you're
Yeah, for
talking about
example,
what, give me some examples of that.
yeah, no. For example, it's clear and it's been documented that the U.S. has not complied with particular decisions on trade in the automotive sector. That the U.S. has breached its obligations on the USMCA for the automotive industry, and Mexico never actually pursued any course of action, placing retaliation, or going the whole 9 yards on that issue. And it's been documented, and it's been based on a ruling that favor Mexico in that regard. No, there are also, just as much as the United States, for example, expresses concern time and time again about the labor rights in Mexico. I am sure that if we go to certain places in the United States, whether those are, the kitchens in a restaurant in Vegas, or the fields in California and Arizona, some of our countrymen will also be, under a stressful situation for labor rights. Let me put it like that. No, in other areas, I mean, there are several things that Mexico could point at. So, what I'm trying to say with this, Ana Maria, I'm trying to encapsulate that. Mexico should also be on the offensive. We should compile our own issues and demand that the U.S. Shows equal commitment and expeditiousness to address those issues, because, well, this again cannot be a situation on which it is only the U.S. demanding from Mexico to take action, and we don't see an equivalent effort on their part. But yes, I think that
Yeah.
Secretary Brad's comments do reflect a very real situation that Mexico needs to be prepared to address.
One last question. Once again, thank you so much for joining us here on Living in Mexico, Juan Carlos Baker. As you know, the Ontario government aired a television ad criticizing Trump's tariffs, using Ronald Reagan's words to frame, the tariffs as being harmful for the United States. And Donald Trump responded by basic terminating trade talks with Canada. Among the issues that Donald Trump mentioned and the reasons why he said he would no longer negotiate with Canada is that the Canadians were trying to influence a decision by the Supreme Court that could affect tariffs or the implementation of tariffs by Donald Trump. So I guess my question is that the fact that Donald Trump announced that he no longer wants to negotiate with Canada, is that going to impact the negotiation or the process by which Mexico is negotiating with the United States? And two, I mean, why is he so concerned about this decision by the Supreme Court?
Yes, I think that the government of Ontario has been characterized by making decisions that are not necessarily aligned with what the federal government thinks in Canada thinks, you know. And the premier Doug Ford, he made some remarks about Mexico a couple of months ago that I won't repeat. But yeah, he's been known for having an initiative on these issues. No? Now, President Trump obviously is punishing all of Canada because of what Ontario did. Which, by the way, President Trump claimed that the speech by Ronald Reagan on the ad that aired was fake, and that's not actually true. The speech is very real. I actually give it to my students in my international trade class to show how quickly the sentiment of the Republican Party in the U.S. has shifted from being pro-trade to be what now Donald Trump made it. But anyway, um, I think that this is also another way of Donald Trump to put pressure on Canada. It's clear that he has a personal dislike for Canadians. That is not going to change. I think that eventually, once that Canada has backed down on something that could be of interest to Donald Trump, those talks will reassume. I mean, this is not going to be permanent. I
Mm-hmm.
think that by the time that the USMCA needs to be again addressed, we will have those talks. I am in no way concerned that those talks or that not talking, if you allow me,
Yeah.
is permanent. And the reason why the Supreme Court decision is so important, it's because several of the policy decisions that Donald Trump has taken recently are based on the ability of the president to place tariffs. No, and what the ad was questioning is precisely that ability, the ability of the president to conduct policy so as to achieve these other goals that we were referring earlier for the case of Mexico. And the decision of the Supreme Court clearly is going to be a watershed in how trade policy is not only discussed but also implemented in the United States. Now, I personally believe that the President Trump is giving way too much credit to the Premier of Ontario by assuming, and again, all of this can be just an excuse, but it will be too much credit given to the Premier of Ontario to assume that the Supreme Judges in the U.S. are going to change their mind just because they watched an ad on TV, right?
Right. No, I agree.
So
Yeah.
this is just a game of politics again. Unfortunately, this game is very costly, Ana Maria, because it implies tariffs, it implies uncertainty, it implies volatility, and again, we we will see a decision in a few days, and I am sure that the next occasion that you invite me to your program, we will come back to those moments and remember what
And
we
kind of
said.
laugh. I just hope that North America as a concept is going to survive all of this. Juan Carlos Baker, once again, thank you so much for joining us here on Living in Mexico.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. We're going to go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and you're listening